Hello everybody, David Ansardi here again, your AMP1 boy toy, here to give you your first lecture video clip for Unit 2, Introduction to Tissues. Why are tissues important? Well look guys, you guys want to go into the medical field, right? You're going to be working with tissues a lot. You're going to have patients who need to blow their nose, they're going to cough, they're going to sneeze, they're going to throw up, you might need to clean up, stuff like that with tissues. You got to know a lot about tissues if you want to be a nurse or work in some other area of the medical field. So because of that, we're going to give you a lecture here at the beginning of Unit 2 about tissues. Should you buy Charmin? Should you use the cheap stuff from Walmart? Those are all very important topics for patient care. So let's go ahead and get started with our introduction to tissues. I don't know, y'all. These ladies in this department, they just keep me permanently confused. They told me I was supposed to lecture about tissues, but they did not tell me that it was this kind of tissues. I wasn't even aware of that. I'm going to have to kind of wing it here, so bear with me. So the types of tissues that I'm actually supposed to lecture to you guys about are actually the tissues you heard a little bit about in Unit 1. Remember when you were learning about your levels of organization and how the levels of organization of the body. You got atoms that are linked together to build molecules. Small molecules linked together to build larger molecules. Those small molecules and larger molecules together are combined to assemble cells, the smallest functional units of living things. And then you may remember from there, you have groups of cells in the body that function together to form the different types of tissues. Okay, so that's where we are in our study of anatomy and physiology. I'm going to bring my pen up here if this will cooperate for me. There we go. Your textbook calls tissues the living fabrics. That's a pretty good analogy. So like you use fabrics, you weave fabrics together to build clothes, curtains, upholstery, different types of things. In sort of a similar manner, these tissues composed from cells working together are woven together to build all of the different parts of your body. Okay, so we'll be learning about those, or you can think about them as like the lumber, the bricks, the concrete, the glass, those types of things that can be assembled together in different ways. You're kind of using the same sets of building materials to build, like you could use those to build a house or a shed or many different things from the same kind of raw materials. Same deal with tissues in your body. You've got a certain group of different types of tissues that you can use to build the different parts of the body. Okay, in lab, you're going to be doing some work on histology. Histology is a term that refers to the study of tissues. So in lab, you're going to be using a light microscope to look at slides containing very, very microscopically thin tissue sections from different parts of the body or even different animals to give you a feel for these different tissues that you're learning about. Okay, what are tissues? What are they composed of? Well, as I mentioned already, tissues are composed of groups of cells that function together. Now, you have two cells. Here's a cell. Here's a cell over here. Here's a cell over here. In a tissue, those cells are not just hanging out there in a dry environment. You learned about that in Unit 1. There is space in between those cells. That space between the cells is called the extracellular matrix. Extra is a prefix that means outside, so outside the cells, and then the matrix is referring to all this stuff that is located between those cells. What does that matrix contain? What does it consist of? Fluid. Remember you learned about extracellular fluid when you were studying body fluids in Unit 1. It has many different solutes dissolved in the fluid. Again, solutes are things like ions, small organic molecules like glucose, amino acids, larger organic molecules like proteins. Anything that's dissolved in that fluid, floating around in that fluid is a solute. And then in some cases, in some types of tissues, you will learn that some of this space, or much of this space in here in between cells, is occupied by special types of proteins that have a fibrous shape or a thread-like shape. Those are called protein fibers. You'll learn a whole lot more about those. Okay, so tissues are woven together to build all the different structures of the body. All of those tissues can be grouped together into 4 major types, and those are epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissues. And for the rest of this chapter in your textbook, you're going to be learning more about those 4 different types of tissues. And in lab, you will see examples of each of those. Let's talk very briefly about nervous and muscle tissue. Ms. Graham will give you a lecture video with more extensive details on these. What is nervous tissue? That's the type of tissue that the parts of your nervous system are primarily composed of. That's not going to be a surprise to you. So things like your brain, your spinal cord, and all of the nerves that branch out and extend to all the different parts of your body, composed primarily of nervous tissue. Nervous tissue major functions: communication, signaling, sending instructions, receiving information. That's major function of the nervous system. Controlling things. You guys know that the brain is like the control center for your body, so that shouldn't be a surprise to you either. You'll learn a whole lot more really about nervous tissue and how it functions when we get to Unit 4 in this class. Okay, and then what about muscle tissue? We all know what muscles are. You guys know that you contract your muscles so that you can move. So that's not going to be a surprise to you that a major function of muscle tissue is contractions for movement. Now those muscles that you contract to move, now you guys know you can control that by thinking about it. So that's voluntary type muscle tissue. But then you have muscles in various locations in your body that you don't have to think about to move. Those are involuntary muscles. Voluntary muscles, the ones that you use, that you think about and you can make them move, those are composed of a type of tissue called skeletal muscle. Muscles that you don't think about to contract are usually composed of smooth or cardiac muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue is located in various places throughout the body, often in walls of hollow organs. Cardiac muscle tissue, you guys know where that is. That's in the walls of your heart. You don't have to think about making your heart beat. Okay, the 2 types of tissues, though, you'll be learning the most about here at the beginning of Unit 2 are epithelial and connective tissues. What are epithelial tissues? Epithelial tissues tend to form very thin layers, and they're located at boundaries within the body. A good example is your skin. At the surface of your skin, you have epithelial tissue that's forming a boundary between the outside of the body and your body itself. But then think about on the inside of your body, in places where you have spaces, like in your hollow organs or inside your blood vessels. Along the linings of those spaces, you have a thin layer of epithelial tissue. Think about the linings of your respiratory tract, along the trachea, down into the bronchi and the bronchioles in the lungs. Along the inside lining of those locations, you have epithelial tissue layers, generally very thin. Because of their locations, these epithelial tissues function largely in secretion and absorption. So they produce things that wind up being released into those spaces, or the cells that are located in those tissues function in absorption, like the epithelial tissues in your respiratory tract will function in oxygen absorption. Epithelial tissues in your small intestine are going to function in absorbing nutrients. Epithelial tissues, one of their major characteristics, they tend to have a lot of cells jam-packed very close together, forming a thin layer, and you don't have a lot of matrix in between those cells. But you'll learn a lot more about that as you move through the unit. What are connective tissues? Connective tissues are the most widespread throughout the body. They're also, they have the greatest variation from one location or one type of connective tissue to another. Connective tissues function in supporting, protecting the body, also binding one type of tissue or one location to another. That's where they get their name, connecting, for connective tissues. A lot of variation here. As you'll see, your bones are composed of connective tissue. Looks like here on this diagram from your textbook, they're highlighting a little patch of fat. Fat is a type of connective tissue. When you get below the surface of your skin, just underneath there, you have fat there, and then you also have additional portions of your skin that are composed of connective tissue. You'll learn a whole lot more about that. Even your blood, believe it or not, is a type of connective tissue because you have cells floating through your blood, and then you have spaces between those cells in a liquid form that are there as well. Lots of variation. Again, with connective tissues, typically your cells in those tissues are spread out further apart, and you have more of that extracellular matrix, that space in between. Okay? Another role for connective tissues throughout the body, they tend to provide passageways, because they kind of play a filler role in a lot of locations, and by providing filler, they provide passageways for little tiny blood vessels and little tiny nerves that have to supply all these different body locations. Let's look at a couple of visuals to help us try to understand these different types of tissues and how they're woven together to build a whole body. This is a chunk of pork shoulder. And guess what, guys? The shoulder of a pig structurally is very similar to, like, if you took a chunk of your shoulder off, and we're taking a look at it. So here's the skin of the poor little pig who donated his shoulder. The surface of the skin composed of epithelial tissue. There it is at a boundary. Now down in here, all the good part of the pork shoulder, the meat, most of that meat primarily composed of skeletal muscle tissue, which is deep to the surface of the skin. And then in between those two, you guys know if you're eating pork shoulder, you got a lot of fat in there between the skin and the meat or the skeletal muscle tissue underneath. Well, that fat is a type of connective tissue. You don't just have fat in there, you have other types of connective tissue in between the surface of the skin and the underlying muscle tissue, but you will learn more about that as you move into the integumentary system. But you see there how the connective tissues are connecting the surface of the skin with the underlying skeletal muscle tissue. I know you guys want to head over to Big Bob Gibson for some barbecue after learning about that, don't you? Let's look at one more example. Let's look at the intestinal wall and how it is built from different types of tissues. You'll be taking a look in lab, most likely, microscopically at an intestinal wall. So you'll get to see the details on this a little bit more. Here's a little chunk of small intestine, okay? And here they're peeling off different portions of the intestinal wall so you can see the different tissue types in there. Okay, notice this kind of pinkish red colored lining along the inside of the small intestine. That's a very thin layer of epithelial tissue. It's going to play a role in absorbing nutrients. Notice that further out from there towards the outer portions of the wall, you have a couple of layers right here and here of smooth muscle tissue. That's there because the intestinal wall has to contract to help slosh the food that you're digesting back and forth, and you also got to, as you guys know, you got to squeeze things from one end of your digestive tract to another. So you have to have muscular tissue in there for those contractions. Then notice that in between the lining and the muscle tissue, they've got this tissue that they've colored gray here, so you can see it. That's going to be connective tissue. The connective tissue is connecting this epithelial layer to the underlying muscle in the wall of the small intestine. Okay? And this connective tissue in here is going to provide filler with passageways for the blood vessels that supply the wall of the intestine. And they're not showing it here, but there would also be some small nerves in there as well. So you would have nervous tissue in the wall of the intestine also. And then finally, at the outermost surface of the small intestine, guess what you have there? Remember those serous membranes you learned about in Unit 1? Remember that the serous membrane that covers the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity is called the visceral peritoneum. Very thin layer, very thin membrane. It's actually composed of a very thin epithelial tissue layer connected to a very, very super thin connective tissue layer. Okay? So as you can see, in an organ like the small intestine, you have examples of these different tissue types woven together to build a functioning intestinal wall. And now that we learned about that, I bet you guys are going to be ready for some chitlins for dinner after you finish your Bob Gibson barbecue for lunch. Okay, that's it for me. That's your introduction to tissues. I will see you guys again in Unit 3. Take care.